As Audrey mentioned, my name's Tom Lutkin, and I'm a project manager who has been incessantly emailing all of you for the past week or so, and I'm on the Energy and Environmental Affairs team here at MBR. I'm very pleased to introduce our welcome speaker, Consul General Judith Ravin. Ms. Ravin assumed the post of Consul General at the U.S. Consulate in Chennai on September 6, 2020. In this post, she's responsible for advancing U.S.-India relations in the consular jurisdiction covering the states of Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, Kerala, and the Union Territories of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands, Lakshadweep, and Puducherry. Her diplomatic career has spanned Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and we're very thrilled to have her opening today's session. Consul General, thank you so much, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Audrey, and if Alison Salwinski is with us, same, and Ashley Johnson, and of course, the National Bureau of Asian Research. I would like to greet Mr. Gagandeep Singh Bedi, IAS Commissioner, Greater Chennai Corporation, and experts on disaster management from India, United States, and Indo-Pacific countries. My greeting goes out across the time zones, including my colleagues at U.S. Consulate General Chennai and our distinguished guests in our virtual audience. Thank you for the honor of participating in the launch of this important conference to deliberate on opportunities for cooperation in disaster response in the Indo-Pacific. According to a recent United Nations report, the Asia-Pacific is the most disaster-prone region of the world. This region has been struck by nearly 1,650 disasters during the last 10 years, amounting to over 40% of the global total. The last 2 years has reminded us more than ever before of the unprecedented challenges posed by natural and man-made disasters around the world. The COVID-19 pandemic, for example, has impacted the lives of millions, directly and indirectly. In recent decades, the frequency of these disasters has increased. They're becoming more significant in terms of magnitude due to continuing growth of the world's population and related developmental activities. The United States, like India, has a long tradition of providing short-term and long-term relief and recovery to disasters, not just within its borders, but beyond, to nations around the world. Organizations such as the U.S. Federal Emergency Management, or FEMA, and the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, continue to save millions of lives globally, providing assistance to victims of disasters. Earlier this year, when the second wave of COVID struck, the U.S. government, through USAID, rapidly deployed 7 plane loads of life-saving supplies to India. These flights carried critical health supplies, including oxygen and oxygen supplies, N95 masks, rapid diagnostic tests, and medicine. The government of India's National Disaster Management Authority and various state disaster management authorities are adopting technology-driven, proactive, multi-hazard, and multi-sectoral strategies to build a safer and disaster-resilient India. Additionally, the government of India has established the Global Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, or CDRI, to help foster disaster and climate resilient infrastructure. USAID is supporting CDRI to develop and share innovations, policy recommendations, and best practices in developing disaster and climate resilient infrastructure in the Indo-Pacific and worldwide. Given the huge and transnational nature of disasters, it is crucial for international and regional cooperation to continue to identify new ways to address these crises and respond in an efficient, effective, and comprehensive manner using time-tested methods as well as modern technology, innovation, and transparent communication. I'm optimistic that the white paper to emerge out of the working group meetings and this National Bureau of Asian Research and US government-led conference will set new standards on Indo-Pacific cooperation in the area of disaster preparedness and response. Thank you, and I hope the project of collaboration will improve overall disaster management capacity, coordination, and trans-border connectivity of countries within the Indo-Pacific region. Thanks so much, and back over to you, Tom or Audrey. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Consul General. We really appreciate those excellent words. In the interim, I apologize to everyone for the short delay. I might turn things over to Ashley Johnson, who'll give us a little bit of context for our first panel so that we can keep things moving. And I think that they should fit quite well in with the commissioner's remarks. Ashley?
Thank you, Tom. And just before we got into that opening panel, I did have a few of kind of my official remarks. And again, thank you to our Consul General for joining us today. It was wonderful to hear from you. And I will likely echo many of the points that you have made. But on behalf of the National Bureau of Asian Research, I am delighted to welcome you all to this workshop and to be able to kick off our opening session as moderator. For those who may be less familiar with NBR and are joining us for the first time today, our core mission is to assess the evolving strategic environment in Asia through original and policy relevant research. And as part of this, connect with leading scholars, policymakers, and other stakeholders to establish a network of experts on priority issues facing the United States and Asia. We are very fortunate to have the opportunity to collaborate with the US Consulate in Chennai to bring together a very wide-ranging group of experts and create a framework on collective action for disaster management. As history has repeatedly shown us, this last year in particular, non-traditional security threats like natural disasters and disease outbreaks can occur at any time, often simultaneously, and do not recognize borders or the delineations of US and our partners in Asia, our government ministries, policies, and approaches. So as experts on various phases of disaster management, each participant gathered today brings critical knowledge of the best practices, lessons learned, and pathways to overcome barriers to cooperation. And fora like this can help identify the gaps in our own understanding and spotlight the areas in which we can improve coordination across the phases of disaster management, preparation, mitigation, response, and recovery, and across the different disciplines that I know, excuse me, that we all represent, from health and human safety and security, energy sustainability, technology, and national security concerns. And so the exciting challenge that we face over the next 2 days is to take our respective areas of expertise and produce a framework that we can hopefully set some of those standards that might improve disaster management going forward in our sectors and across others as well. And I will say a few notes of thanks before we turn back to Mr. Bedi and then transition into our first panel. But of course, this would not be possible without all of you joining us today and our colleagues who helped organize this event. So a few acknowledgments I would like to make before we get started. Of course, to our colleagues at the US Consulate in Chennai, we've been very grateful for your ongoing support and collaboration on this program. We have two excellent senior advisors, Ambassador Tariq Karim and Ms. Nalanthi Saramanayake, who helped provide guidance, critical guidance at the outset, and introduced us to many of you who have joined us today. For the experts that have contributed their time and expertise through informational interviews and our working group sessions, an additional debt of gratitude is owed. We really appreciate the comments and questions you pose, which helped refine today's workshop. To the new experts who have joined us, we look forward to hearing your own comments and contributions over the course of the ensuing discussions. And finally, to my colleagues here at NBR, Tom Lutkin, who you have all had the pleasure of interacting with as he's really led all of these efforts to get us here today, and to Micah Sindelar, Jahiro Aita, Kylie Del Rosario, and of course, Audrey Mossberger, our Director of Events. Without all of them, we would not be here. This would not be possible. So thank you to my colleagues at NBR, again, to all of you. I will pause with my opening remarks. We'll hear some more from Mr. Bedi, and then we'll jump into the continuation of our discussion. I know it'll be a really very productive next 2 days. So thank you all again for being here.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I joined you little delayed because I was in a meeting relating to COVID vaccination conducted by my boss, that is the Chief Secretary of Tamil Nadu. So, corporation commissioners are, the time is really not in the hands of the corporation commissioners. In between, I have got a break of 5 minutes and then I have to go for another scheduled meeting where again is being held by the Chief Secretary. But I didn't want to miss this meeting because over here I am seeing the Consul General of US Consulate in Chennai, and all of you great people who are over here. Kindly apologize me for not addressing each one of you individually, but let me say that I am very happy to be a part of this occasion. Since I have joined directly, I will just give a few thoughts of mine relating to the disaster management from my experience, and then I will also talk about the Chennai's preparedness in this regard. You know, as such, the cities have to be always be prepared in terms of disaster management because disasters are coming very frequently now across the entire globe. In fact, I have across the last 2 decades personally experienced and handled various disasters, and those disasters include, of course, the 2004 tsunami, where I was that time a district collector in Kadlu district. And thereafter, we saw a series of cyclones in this part of the state, in Tamil Nadu, right from the 2011 cyclone to the Nisha cyclone to the Varda cyclone. And then there was the Oki cyclone in Kanyakumari and the Gaja cyclone in Nagapattinam, which devastated. And we have all been a part. I have been a part of all this, and government officials and city bodies and the government has always been a part of the entire disaster response mechanisms. You know, whatever we do in the peace times, it is during the disaster times that the real managerial capabilities and the strength of an organization is really tested. And whatever you do in the peace times, if you actually mess up in the disaster times, then you don't really get a good name, and the entire community blames you. And those few memories actually make or mar the name of the government or the local body concerned. It's over here that I will like to say that each and every city, local body, state and central government should actually keep itself prepared for handling the disasters. And this preparation has to be always in 3 phases. The first phase being the rescue phase, which is the most crucial. The second is the recovery phase, and third is the rehabilitation phase. In fact, I will say that the first rescue phase, which is in the first, say, either say 48 hours or 72 hours, which is the most important. In fact, the rescue phase is important, and the city government has to be always be prepared for ensuring its preparedness at any point of time, and that preparedness does include keeping robust infrastructure, such as for any sort of disasters, and that includes, of course, pre-disaster preparedness, training of the community, and then thereafter infrastructure for removing, say, if it is a cyclone or a flood or an earthquake, etc. Keeping all the equipments that you need on day one, for example, power saws, the earth-moving machineries ready at hand, boats, life jackets, the emergency lights, mass emergency lights, swimmers, snake catchers, and all the temporary rescue vehicles and temporary rescue places, fully equipped with drinking water and the sanitation facilities. These are all very important aspects which have always to be kept ready. And mind me, if you have succeeded in the first 48 or 72 hours, you have won half the battle. So this is the first and foremost thing for which adequate planning of months and years is important for tackling disasters in the first 48 to 72 hours. And I feel in this regard, the government of Tamil Nadu in general and city of Greater Chennai, we always keep a lot of emphasis on our infrastructure availability and the machinery and training of the staff in order to cope up to the level of disaster, the magnitude of the disaster in the first 48 or 72 hours, based on the level of the disaster. The second aspect is the recovery phase, where once the people, the injured have been given treatment, the rest, if there are any casualties, they have been taken care of. If any roads are blocked that have been opened up, then it is the recovery phase. The recovery phase is equally important. The recovery phase might include the housing of the displaced people temporarily in the temporary manner, giving them food, giving them water supply, giving them adequate health infrastructure, restoring the lines of communication, and taking care of especially the underprivileged. And the underprivileged include the old and the children, and also the socially and economically backward classes who always get hit by the disasters, and especially the women. The women are always vulnerable to the disasters. So we need an adequate preparation at all these levels to ensure that the recovery phase, that in my opinion will be generally for any sort of disaster, say between 2 to 3 weeks or up to 1 month or 2 month period, depending on the level of disaster, are very important. And this also requires a lot of preparation of the community for months together, for the years together, and each and everything should be in a copybook style, and each and every person should know his or her responsibility. And the most important is a common thread in order to match every, in order to ensure the linkage of every stakeholder in this regard, and ensure a success in the recovery process. The final thing I will just highlight is the rehabilitation process. The rehabilitation actually makes or mars the image of that community. And the rehabilitation process includes having type designs for disaster resilient buildings, infrastructure, common buildings, individual houses, roads, the shelters, and even the movable, the boats and other things, which are important in order to ensure that in future, if this sort of a disaster does come up, then the community should be better equipped to face that, and the type of losses that the community faces are not there. These are all very important, and it's always important to keep on discussing the entire concept of disaster as we are doing today over here in this August forum. And I must say that with my experience, I have handled the disaster right from tsunami onwards and various disasters. I've also been to Katrina in Missouri. I was part of that Indo-Pacific disaster management seminars, schedules, and visits, where I had gone to Hawaii in the Asia Pacific Disaster Management Institute, and been part of the seminars. I have addressed gatherings over there. I've also shared my experiences with the city of Bonn and other places where we had partnership at that point of time. We also had partnership with various universities across Americas, etc. So we always tend to learn from such sharing of experiences, and also learning to the sharing of experiences of the other stakeholders, other communities and officials, city government officials, who share their experiences and also show how they have recovered from that phase. Within India also, there are a lot of experience sharing opportunities that have always been made available. And my message to everybody is that that we should never consider ourselves to be fully equipped for any disaster. We are always under-equipped. We should keep our ears and eyes open. We should keep the doors of our learning process always open in order to ensure that we keep on learning in and out. We should keep on improving our infrastructure. We should keep on sharing best practices with each other, type designs and other best practices with each other, so that as a society, whether we are in Tamil Nadu or at other parts of the country or other parts of the world, we all mutually help each other and ensuring that we are a more strong and resilient community. With these few words, I would like to thank the Consul General of the US and all the organizers over here for having called me to share my thoughts with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Bedi. Commissioner, we very much appreciate your time, and we understand that the current state of affairs is definitely a busy one for someone such as yourself. So thank you very much for your opening remarks and for your excellent insights. Moving the program along, I'm pleased to reintroduce Ashley Johnson, who will be moderating our first session.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Mr. Bedi. I think you actually hit on most of the framing points for this panel as we look at this opening session, which is those first 24 hours. First 24 to 72 hours are indeed the most important as we look at disaster recovery, and how nations respond in that is often the most public-facing show of their managerial capabilities. So thank you, Mr. Bedi, for highlighting that. I think you've done most of my work for me as we jump into this first panel. And so I will just introduce our two speakers very briefly. Please do look at the agenda that does include their full bios, because they are very accomplished and we don't want you to miss out on the many things that they have done, but I'll just do their titles and affiliations at the outset. We'll first hear from Captain Sarabjit Parmar, who is the Executive Director of the National Maritime Foundation and has a distinguished career in the Indian Navy. After we hear from Captain Parmar, we'll turn to Dr. Alistair Cook, who's the coordinator of the Humanitarian Assistance and Disaster Relief Program and a senior fellow at the Center for Nontraditional Security Studies at Nanyang Technological University. So I will stop with my introduction there and we'll jump directly into the discussion. So with that, I'll turn to Captain Parmar.
Okay, thank you, Ashley. And Consul General, good evening. Captain Parmar here. And Mr. Bedi, if you're still listening, it was a pleasure listening to your opening remarks. And I am here today as a person who has participated in many HADR operations. Being a helicopter pilot in the Navy, it comes with the turf. And also, now that I have switched roles onto sort of academic thinking, it's part and parcel, and I try to bridge the gap between research analysis and actual boots on ground. And Consul General, you mentioned CDRI in your opening remarks, and we're pleased to inform you that the National Maritime Foundation, 3 of our researchers have one of the first CDRI fellowships, but I will let my colleague Dr. Push Bajaj speak about it when he talks about it tomorrow. So we are at NMF, we do look at these issues and we do push the policy agendas as much as we can. But having said that, and I know that we are a little rushed for time, so Tom gave me 3 issues to cover. One was discuss the role of the Indian Navy in the first hours of disaster response and India's role as a leader in disaster management in South Asia. But I'll extend that a little bit and with Dr. Cook's permission, maybe tread on a little bit of a path, but he's the expert from that area, so he'll add on. He will put me on the correct path if I err anywhere. Then, of course, key objectives to accomplish and errors to avoid during disaster response. And what is the need from the international community during the first phases of disaster response? So having said that, I think the stage has already been set. We all know the stages: preparatory, initial response, sustenance, rehabilitation, recovery, stabilization, redeployment, and reconstruction. But going on to that, let's look at the initial response stage. So this stage, what I'm telling you is given in the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium guidelines, which were also circulated to the IORA nations, but a little more about that later on. So the initial response stage, if we look at it, it's going to commence from the warning of the disaster, if we have enough warning time, that is, to the period immediately after the disaster. And the aim of this initial response stage, it's 24 to 72 hours, is brought out, aims at providing immediate relief to the affected population and bringing a semblance of normalcy in the affected area. Now, this semblance of normalcy is important because the moment you bring in a semblance of normalcy, people automatically start behaving in a normal fashion, in a normal way. And that is a big boost insofar as the first steps of recovery are concerned. The key is mobility. You have to get in fast. You have to assess the situation. You have to adapt to the realities on ground. And as Mr. Bedi said, each disaster has a different angle to it. And there's a learning lesson the moment you land up on ground and look around you and you realize this is something we had not even thought about or we didn't maybe perhaps cater for. And therefore, the first action is to call out for the type of reliefs required so that the subsequent trains that follow, which carry the equipment, which carry more people, and which carry the right type of equipment perhaps required based on what how the situation is assessed, follow through quickly. To give you an example, let's go back to 2004 when the tsunami was there. And I'm sharing an anecdote which was told to me by my colleague who was in Chennai on holiday during tsunami. And he said that the ocean just withdrew. He's a naval officer and he says he sensed trouble. So the reaction time wasn't much. Perhaps we were not used to having tsunamis at such the way it came in 2004. But the action taken by the Navy and of course the government of India was that within the first 12 hours, we had Indian naval helicopters landing in Sri Lanka with relief material. And in the next 24 hours, 2 Indian naval ships were already in Galle and Trincomalee. Now, 24 hours seems a large segment of time. But the fact of the matter is that the moment we had this inkling warning and the tsunami hit, the ships were prepared and sailed out well in advance. And they were actually en route when the requests from the Sri Lankan government and other nations started coming in. So therefore, we saved time. So again, mobility is the key. Get in fast. So we had 2 naval ships in Galle and Trincomalee. 3 others had been dispatched to Malé. And within 72 hours, we had converted 2 naval ships into hospital ships and they were sent to Indonesia. So that's the method in which the first reaction of 2004 took place. What are the actions that you need to look at? When you land up, first of all, is medical relief camps. Nothing gives a person who has been hit by disaster more comfort than seeing a person with a stethoscope or somebody with a Red Cross, and you know that things are going to be all right, semblance of normalcy comes back in. The second most important thing is you need to evacuate the critically ill or injured personnel. This is something that the ad hoc relief camps based on ground or even in ships, when we entered Paradip in 99, we realized that there were many wounded and critically ill people whom our doctor could not look after, but somehow we managed to evacuate them. A lot of them survived. This is a second thing on ground that needs to be done. Parallelly, you need to set up temporary structures and shelters, which means that you need to carry the right equipment. And I'll come to the carriage of right equipment by ships and all by ships the world over a little later, but this needs to be done. Protection from the elements. Give them dry ground. Where you have a tsunami, where you have water, it's very uncomfortable working in or living in damp clothes for more than 24 hours. So therefore, you need to give them some sort of dry shelters. Then, of course, food, water, and clothing to the affected people, which means that you should carry the right amount of food, the right type of food, the right type of clothing, depending upon the area in which you are providing relief. The next thing is communication. Open your channels of movement. Activate ports. It took us some time in 99 in Paradip to get the port going because all the navigational aids and everything were destroyed. So we got into the act. Our hydro services came in. They set up temporary indicators. Ships could come in and go. Get the airfields going. Where you have flooding of the airfield, you need to set up helicopter landing sites. In fact, in the first sortie, we took off and we went to Bhubaneswar, which is the capital city of Orissa. The runway was under 5 feet of water. There was no way you could land except one small dry patch. Being a helicopter, we managed to land. We managed to give relief supplies to the airfield and the airport person who had been stuck there for more than 72 hours. So second is opening channels of communication. Get things going. Get your relief trains moving in as soon as possible. Then is setting up an emergency power supply for hospitals, get them going. Airport, I've already mentioned, and communication centers. You need to speak to people. You need to spread the word out. And this is where you have to adapt and call for type of relief required, you must understand what is the requirement. So therefore, there is a need to have this sort of equipment stored somewhere. So it comes to that. And then, of course, is the assistance toward rehabilitation. It takes a long time. So these are the steps that essentially required in the initial response stage. But it is not necessary that these are to be followed in this sequence. Totally depends upon the situation on ground. So there is nothing that you can write down in an SOP, step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. You'll have to move it up and down. And even say in 2 adjoining districts, the priority of these objects may change. So you need to be flexible to thought. The man on ground should be able to take a cognitive decision and decide what is the priority and what needs to be done. Of course, one main issue is pandemics, is the clearing up of dead bodies, clearing up of water, ensuring that the right prevention medicines come in, that the right amount of disinfectants come in. We need to start spraying that. Otherwise, the pandemic is going to add to the agony of the relief. Therefore, that needs to be looked into. So this is an automatic process that is followed. And the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium has some guidelines issued again I'll cover it in a little while. So getting back to the fact, so how does the Navy look at it? So the tsunami was a sort of big learning lesson for the Navy, Indian Navy especially, and many other navies. And while we have changed our deployment pattern to the more dynamic mission-based deployments, what we have learned is that the ship at any given time needs to change or shift its role, whether it's on a piracy patrol or it's going for an overseas deployment for a longish period of time, to be able to change its role to meet HADR missions or even evacuation missions. So the first thing we learned is that if a ship sails out to save on time, we are going to put what we call HADR bricks on it. So the bricks carry the right amount of medicines depending upon the size of the ship. The bigger the ship, obviously, more stuff you can carry and storage is required. Medicines, ready to, or MREs, what is called made ready to eat meals, tentage, blankets, you name it, it's there. But then again, it would depend upon the region to which it is going for a deployment. So accordingly, all Indian naval ships always, at any given time when they sail out, carry the minimum HADR material required for immediate relief. And these we are called bricks. This provides the required flexibility and speed, again, mobility, as I said, get in fast. So that you are able to divert ships anywhere at the shortest possible time to provide that assistance in its area of operations. I can give you 3 recent examples. One is the earthquake and tsunami of Indonesia in October 2018, where we had 3 ships were going on overseas deployment across the South China Sea. This earthquake happened. Immediately, the ships were told just turn and head towards Indonesia. And these ships were actually available on site much before the Indonesian or the nation itself would start responding. That is mobility. Second was example I'll give you, Cyclone Diane, Madagascar, January 2019. Again, there was a ship on a mission-based deployment, was diverted immediately, and it went in to provide assistance. And then Mozambique, Cyclone Idai, March 2019. The same thing. We had 2 ships heading south, going towards South Africa. They were told immediately to turn. But the assistance is provided by India based on the request of the host nation. And that is something we need to, I think, look at more carefully. All these actions and what we've done, including in the pandemic, ongoing COVID pandemic, or the HADR responses, which we have done, has made India the first responder in the maritime domain, insofar as the Indian Ocean region is concerned. So it's all about cooperation. There's not one single nation who can do it alone. I think Tsunami 2004 provided us a lot of lessons that if you have a certain capability, but not the capacity, but there's another nation who's got the capacity, but not the capability, join hands. I think the method by which the US and India joined hands was a clear indication of how things went. To give you a small example, and this is from lessons learned on ground, that when we went into Sri Lanka, drinking water. So the wells had to be cleared. How do you clear the wells? You require pumps. Ships inherently carry a lot of these mobile pumps, because in case of a flooding on a ship, or if there's a collision and you need to take water out, those pumps are used. But the capacity of those pumps varies. The bigger the pump, the heavier it is, transportation required. Helicopters come into play. So this is where the US and the Indian Navies combined forces, and we were able to move heavy duty pumps Where we had the helicopters, we helped. Where we didn't have, the US helped. So we were actually able to get drinking water to the villages in various spread out places in a faster time than normal. So that is an important immediate step. A self-sufficiency of that area itself is restored. That's an important aspect we need to look at. So this is one lesson we learned from 2004 is mobility, speak to each other, cooperate. What do you have? What do I have? Let's get together and let's move into the area fast. So if you look at all about cooperation, I will just take you to 9th August, where our Prime Minister spoke at the United Nations Security UNSC, where India was holding the presidency for a month. And he spoke on the open debate on enhancing maritime security, a case for international cooperation. Out of the 5 principles and mantras which he spoke about, the third was global community must face natural disasters and maritime threats posed by terrorists together. So maritime threats posed by terrorists is another issue, but must face natural disasters together. And that is something we have learned over a long period of time. When we look at the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative, among the 7 pillars, India has taken the lead in maritime security and disaster risk reduction and management. And there is a legacy behind why India does this. So even in IORA, there are 6 priority areas where India has again taken the lead in disaster risk management. I think it comes with the turf where we have been battered by cyclones along the western and eastern coast for a long time, obviously, and we are we have the advantage that we are centrally located, so therefore we're able to reach out equally in all directions in the shortest possible time with our whatever assets we have. But more importantly is that we are able to bring, I think, nations together, if I can use that term. So IORA is one issue, there's one place where a lot of work still needs to be done. There is still a lot of slow movement on this aspect. I consider IORA a better option than SARC, and Dr. Cook, with due apologies, I managed to browse through the article which you wrote. I know you've written on SARC, but I have a reason to say this, is that when, say, a cyclone starts building up and it moves north from the southern Indian Ocean, it's not only the SARC countries, it's going to hit the IORA nations altogether, where you have Mozambique, Madagascar, eastern coast of Africa, and down the line here you've got Malaysia, Indonesia, and of course in the Bay of Bengal up there. So I think IORA is a better platform in which we can look at international cooperation for HADR. BIMSTEC is a beautiful example where we've had disaster management exercises in October 2017 and February 2020. First was in New Delhi and the second was in the city of Puri in Odisha. This is a lead by the National Disaster Relief Force of India. So BIMSTEC is one example where we can look at things within the IORA in a more comprehensive fashion. Then comes the issue of Quad. So when we look at the Quad, we need to, sorry, anything?
I was actually going to very quickly interject as you were talking about some of those key points. If we might also then turn it to Dr. Cook, both speaking about his article, but some of these other areas of cooperation, the crossover, as I know we said at the outset too, some of those transporter connectivity issues, I know are something that Dr. Cook also focuses on. And I have many questions, so everyone be prepared for that. But if that is all right, Captain Parmar, we'll very quickly pivot to Dr. Cook, and then we'll
I'm absolutely good with that.
A few points.
All right. It's an informal chat.
All right, thank you. Dr. Cook, over to you.
Great. Well, thank you to everyone at MBR and to Captain Parmar as well for your comments. Yeah, in our recent report, we looked at a number of the different regional platforms which are being used increasingly to cover issues of disaster management or environmental security or these other non-traditional security threats. And they all have their pluses and minuses. That's not me just getting out of it, but IORA has a huge membership, very hard to move that ship, right? We've got SARC, and that has its own challenges. BIMSTEC as well seems to be the most functional, increasingly so in this area. But if I may just start off with a couple of points, and to build on what Captain Parmar sort of either intentionally or not set me up to say, is one, I think what he mentioned there is the first thing is not to think about all these different phases of the disaster management cycle as being independent silos. We really have a problem of sectoral silos in our thinking, in the way we approach hazards, natural hazards, and pandemics, and other human-induced disasters. So I think the first challenge we have is we have to find ways to bring down those sectoral silos. One of the ways we've seen that is in the in what Captain Palmer had said, is learning from and recalibrating those different experiences. And so there are niche capabilities available for each of those areas where they could bring something to the table. One of those I would put in that bridges a number of those phases is anticipatory action, which is a bit of a buzzword that we're hearing now, but essentially it's talking about the early warning systems that Captain Palmer mentioned before, right? So when we looked at what happened in Europe this past summer with the flooding, they were well prepared. They had the early warning systems. They had the information and ability to do it, but they lacked the political will to actually evacuate the people from the areas which were being impacted the most. So I guess it's a very stark reminder that above all, we also need political will in order to drive through these decisions, that we can have all the infrastructure and the technology and scientific basis, but without political will, we're going to be stymied there. And then it made me think about assessment and what we've seen in Southeast Asia, and this has been where there's been a lot of development, where we've seen individual ASEAN member countries contribute particular expertise to the development of ERAT, which is the Emergency Response and Assessment Team, from their different experiences. You know, whether it is typhoons in the Philippines or whether you have infrastructure collapse, dam collapse in the Mekong and so on, that everyone has a different set of skills to bring to the table. And so facilitating that, particularly at a regional level, is beneficial because some might be more exposed than other particular areas in that area. So ASEAN has been very good at doing that. But I don't think it's necessarily the only, well, it's not the only forum that we see activity in this area. And so I did want to flag here as well the Regional Consultative Group on Humanitarian Civil Military Coordination, which is chaired by OCHA and includes South Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Islands. And that has been a really productive forum that I've been involved with, fortunately, since 2014. And they've had 5 priority countries, including Nepal, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Philippines, and Indonesia. And each of those countries have presented more or less every year. They're supposed to, but not everyone does, to share some of their developments in what the lessons learned that they've had and how they're moving those forward from their particular examples and what can be learned from that. And so a couple of those I thought I would just flag here in terms of the response. One was and it was more by fortune than by design, that there was additional staging area in Nepal after the earthquake. But this really highlighted the need for having strategic supply chain resilience in the aftermath of a natural hazard that we saw there, that we saw Kathmandu Airport get completely overwhelmed with the amount of incoming goods, some appropriate, some not appropriate, as is usually the case. So I think that's one thing for us to flag, is this need for that strategic supply chain resilience. That will facilitate being able to get in fast. Now, another way around that is to ensure you've got pre-positioned goods. Now, obviously, this doesn't extend to things like food and water, because they will have expiry dates, but they can be strategically pre-positioned. And ASEAN has set up regional warehouses now to stockpile some of the necessary medical equipment and the, say, household packs that are needed in deployment. So there's one in the Mekong, one in the Philippines, and so on and so forth there. So that is another perhaps idea that we can flag, is to assess in the South Asian region, you know, where there are those perhaps strategic points of entry and strategic points of potential areas where there can be stockpiles. And so I think those are the key points that made me think from Captain Palmer's intervention. But I did want to mention a few others that I've been thinking about quite a bit recently. And one of those, and the Consul General mentioned this, was over information. And I think what we're seeing now is we have a situation where we've had this explosion of information. It's over almost 15 years plus now. So what do we do with all this information? We're generally seeing about 70-30 split. 70% is nonsense and 30% is pretty accurate. So how do we deal with that in a crisis situation, right? That you're having a lot of people being told all kinds of things which are not appropriate for them to be doing it, and then they lose trust in the authorities if they're being counteracted with all these different messages. So one of the aspects that I've recently been involved in is a workshop on disinformation in disaster management. And one of the issues that we generally see is that it's really dominated by traditional security establishment, right? That we talk about info wars, we talk about all the sort of high politics, but we don't really look about community empowerment. We don't try and look at ways to enable people to separate out the wheat from the chaff, so what's good, what's not good, and looking at ways that we can build up those capacities. So in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, one of the ways that we're seeing emerge in those two regions, one is that we've had the development of the Pacific Data Hub, which is to try and encourage a shift from need to know to need to share by providing a safe, secure platform to share data across sectors, across countries, and so on, to try and better inform decisions. And they do that as well by empowering communities. So they allow communities to input what their needs assessments are in a way that builds trust with funders, with the private sector, because it's on a platform that is trusted by all the participants. Because one of the issues we generally see is that community organizations tend to have less trust with the private sector. The private sector think they can't manage money, for example. So a platform like this facilitates that trust building between the different actors, and you have data-driven projects being put into the system, which are being community-led. So that has been a really significant development. Now, whether this can be applied in different regions, it won't be cookie cutter, but there are definitely it's an instructive example. In Southeast Asia, we've had the same in Malaysia with Kita Match, which has been placed between the government, the Red Cross movement, the government-linked companies and foundations there. And that's also been doing the same since it was set up last year, not post-COVID, but after COVID really impacted the region. So I think there are a number of ideas there in terms of assessment that can be thought about, what might be useful and instructive for South Asia there. I've got more to say, but I do want to just allow Captain Palmer to perhaps say something else. Or Ashley, back to you, and then I can interject whenever you allow me.
Wonderful. Well, I might give a little bit of the housekeeping. If any of our participants do have questions that you would like to pose immediately, please do raise your hand. I'll call on you. We can integrate those. I will ask that you do keep your question to about a minute. You can also include a comment. We do welcome your expertise, but again, as you keep it relatively brief, we also have our breakout session, as Tom mentioned, tomorrow as our last panel to really dive into some of those other things that we can't get to in these sessions. So please do keep your questions relatively brief, but if you do have any, please do let me know, and I will get to you. But I will also use my moderator role to put out the first question to both of our speakers, which you've both hit on this in some capacity, and both at the community level, but also at the national level, is that question of kind of the trust and concerns of national security, national sovereignty, of you must be invited to come support. Captain Parmar, as you said, from the naval perspective, and sometimes there might be security concerns of providing that aid. I think as we saw in 2007, 2008 with Cyclone Nargis in Myanmar, but also at that community level of how do you help build that trust to work with other stakeholder groups in communities that might be disenfranchised or often overlooked. So I think there's a similar thread in two very different situations, and I might put that to both of you of how we might continue to do the trust building to increase the effectiveness and rapid response that we can kind of amplify some of those efforts.
Alice, Dr. Cook? Like me to go first, or would you like to take it on?
You go first.
All right. So I'll go back to what Dr. Cook said, about if a place is inaccessible, then you need a staging place from where you can launch your relief operations. That staging place may be in another nation. So again, the question of security and the acceptability by that nation to permit aircraft relief trains from other nations to come in, land, and then thereafter stage operation. This is something that needs to be looked at, and this is where the trust issue comes in. But having said that, I'll just take a mention on the HADR guidelines, which have been worked upon by the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium. The guidelines have been accepted by the chiefs of conclave way back in 2018. The same guidelines have been circulated to IORA nations, the same nations whose navies are members of IONS and have accepted the guidelines. IORA is unable to come to an acceptance of those guidelines. So that trust factor will come only when the IORA nations, for example, this IORA for the guidelines, come together and say that, yes, this is how we need to operate, because that is from where the political direction comes. The rest of it can be done. Insofar as the navies are concerned, there's a lot of work which has been done. There's a lot of work which is being done insofar as HADR is concerned. And more recently, there is a new set of guidelines doing the rounds, is the evacuation of non-combatants from areas which have been hit by disasters. And this has been started by, I think, Australia after the bushfires that happened. That's another aspect that needs to be looked at, because this has more sensitivities than perhaps launching of relief operations. Having said that, I think it's time, and I've mentioned this earlier also, that we need to look at guidelines of HADR operations under a pandemic situation as has gone by. The number of operations we have done under the pandemic is immense. And at the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium level, navies have shared these experiences. This just needs to be bouqueted outwards and accepted at a political level. The trust will automatically build up. And I'll stop here for the time being.
Great. That's just given me a great entry point, actually. So the point you made there about HADR operations during the pandemic is a really important one. This is something that we've seen really impact the way in which countries in South Asia and Southeast Asia and the Pacific have been responding, right? So I think my main point here would be is we really need to be looking again at what we call strategic foresight in disaster risk management. There's not been very much done in terms of implementation. There's been a lot of conversations around this, but and there are two, I think, important points here. One is what is being called the Pandora cell. So that's looking at our immediate alternative futures. So something where we have COVID hits, and then we already know every year pretty much we're going to have A, B, and C kind of natural hazards occur. So we need to be game planning those to see how we're going to deal with the reduced number of people you can have in evacuation centers, or the longer time it's going to take for goods to go through quarantine, or to ensure that you've had those conversations to set up what are being called importation channels, humanitarian lanes, whatever we want to call them, but ways to facilitate the movement of goods. Because as going back to what Captain Palmer said at the beginning, after 72 hours, you're counting bodies, not saving lives. So if it's going to take you 6 days to clear customs in a Pacific island during a cyclone, then those goods are already more or less redundant in the whole, right? They'll still be used, but I mean, for the primary purpose, it was a real issue. So we need to be thinking about how we can facilitate some of those concerns during emergencies. And the second part of the strategic futures is really to try and embed as well thinking within institutions. And this isn't just about national disaster management offices. This is broadly across government in terms of looking both in the immediate future, but also the longer term future, and planning from that future. We've had, and it was mentioned earlier by the Council General, the IPCC report, and that's given us projections for 2050. So if we are going to move to a resilient, prosperous, and having well-being for our populations, what is it that we need to be doing now in order to achieve that by 2050? And there needs to be a lot more effort put into some of those cross or trans-governmental issues in trying to, and I sound too jingoistic now, but building synergy in government, right? That there are far too many of these silos or fiefdoms, however we want to look at them. And the second point, to build on what Captain Palmer said, is to think again about where the different configurations of cooperation. We don't have to be stuck in a mindset that regional cooperation has to be in SAARC or Southeast Asian cooperation has to be in ASEAN only. Like, sure, they will be a significant anchor, but that's not the only way things get done, right? So, and the point here is if we look at ADMM, so the ASEAN Defense Ministers meeting, we have at the moment India and Indonesia being the co-chairs of the HADR working group, right? So this could be a transboundary, a trans-regional way to address some of these issues we have with HADR and implementing lessons learned. So I think with those 2 points there, just hopefully for people to chew on a little bit, I'll stop here because I don't want to dominate the conversation.
I think those are excellent points. And Captain Parmar, if you had any immediate response back to that, I will defer to you. But if not, I will also pose another question. Okay, off to me then. So then I might pose, as we get ready for some of our ongoing conversations over the next 3 sessions, what are some of the lessons from this phase, from this immediate recovery phase, that can help inform some of the other phases of the process? Maybe what are some things that already exist that you think are particularly effective, leveraged throughout the different phases of disaster management, or things that you think should exist but don't?
I think I'll let Dr. Cook go first this time.
Thank you, I think. So I guess my first reply is that if you're in a disaster or emergency situation and you are then exchanging name cards, it's too late, right? So we can't be thinking about emergency situations without having prepared for them. And I think the biggest lesson that can be learned from any emergency situation is not to be reactive, that we have to be proactive. And that means by meeting, not necessarily all the time, because limited resources, but making sure that there is a systematic way to be engaging with the people you're likely to see in these situations. And that can be in a number of knowledge sharing platforms, whether it is a regional consultation or whether it is simulated exercises. We've seen the explosion of access to online platforms during COVID. So this has shown us at least that it's a lot easier to meet. It doesn't replace the face-to-face human interaction, but it certainly does reduce a lot of the barriers for a number of these meetings and us attending. So I think I'll stop there, but I think the one biggest takeaway is to make sure that you've got a plan and that you've prepared for it beforehand.
I think one important lesson we always learn from a certain disaster is the importance of NGOs who have, if I may say, little deep pockets and the capacity and capability to aid the helpers on ground. And that is more important because, say, when the military or the foreign helpers or the rescuers, when they need to move out, there is a smooth handover and there is no, you've been working together. So the people on ground of that particular country or for that particular NGO are able to smoothly the seamless handing over of the issues. And this builds up into the subsequent stages of recovery. But then the question is that different nations view some organizations with a little degree of doubt, suspicion, or skepticism. That is something that needs to be addressed. And but I think it's going to be a problem every time. But at least we can try to identify which are the right organizations to carry along in the initial recovery stage.
If I might
just chip in.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, yeah, just to build on that, I think the other thing we need to think about as well is when we are preparing, it is to not only think about those different actors which are involved, but also it's not only about one country versus another country. We need to be testing across the services, across the government departments, so whoever's relevant in those situations. And often we forget to be doing that when we're thinking about whole of government approaches, right? That often a lot of time, particularly in the policy world, is spent on international cooperation rather than also thinking about whole of government and having whether it is the different military services or different civilian agencies working together as well.
That is an excellent point. Also thinking about some of the whole of government as we look at kind of whole of region, the defense ministers meeting that you flagged, Dr. Cook and Captain Parmar, as you were going through SARC, BIMSTEC, IORA, all of these different organizations. And as you've each noted, some of them have special capabilities that make them more effective than others, and some that maybe aren't doing enough. But I also might then pose in a hypothetical situation, is there a kind of super organization, or if there we could combine different aspects of certain organizations, how might you construct that? That might include some of those NGOs or the parts that you think of SARC or of BIMSTEC, the defense ministers meeting, as we think of what might be the most effective deployment of each of those organizations. If we could pick and choose from each, how might we construct something new?
It's like constructing geometry, Ashley. Is that, do you want circles or do you want rectangles in a way, and how do you link them together? But I think it's, I don't think it's necessary to build any super body per se. To give you an example, there is an overlap of organization, governments, and nations. So, example between IORA and ASEAN. So these nations are common factors. Right, you will have similarly an overlap, say, between the African Union and IORA. And when you go across the whole Indo-Pacific, I can say that you will have these 7 to 8 countries, or maximum maybe 10 countries. I'm just giving a figure out here, who would be able to understand or synchronize the thinking, or try to get all nations to think alike across the board. It's a tough call, but it can be tried, whether you, the overlapping nation, the common nations who there. And a lot of nations also have observer status. So therefore, it adds to the weight of the argument to push agendas through. So if we identify the organizations, non-governmental and perhaps even governmental, who can be brought into play across the board, then you have a seamless sort of a movement, say from, if I look at the Indo-Pacific, say from the east coast of Africa, right up to, say, maybe the Pacific Islands out there. So trying to construct something, I mean, with IORA as an example, I mean, they're not able to have consensus on the guidelines which IONS has accepted. So the bigger organization you create, the tougher it is. But if you have these overlapping segments of circles, I think the job is a little easier. But I'll defer to Dr. Cook in his remarks.
So I think with that in mind, there is no easy answer. One of the, I guess, biggest challenges, and perhaps something that is achievable, is ensuring lines of communication, right? So one of the greatest difficulties that we see is miscommunication when we're going across national boundaries. But that seems pretty low bar. So I would think maybe there's a prospect here for looking at what they've been doing with the Pacific Data Platform, and perhaps using, you know, an idea of that, having it in those sub-regions, and maybe IORA could then be the central node for it, because essentially all those data sharing platforms should be doing the same thing, and you don't want to be replicating more data, right? You don't need another app to download onto your phone. You just want to have fewer apps, or I would, on my phone to be doing things. So perhaps there's a way to bring together the different regions within another larger grouping, which would be a way to facilitate information exchange, particularly things like disaggregated data, trying to learn what's happening in affected communities, down to as much detail as can be given, and to encourage us to move from a need to know to a need to share information sharing culture.
Excellent. All right, I see it. Tom, turn it over to you.
Ashley, I might take the inside track with a participant question, but I did want to ask both of our panelists. One of the aims that you all have both identified has to do with the proper stakeholders, with the proper education for the people who need to know and need to disclose and things like that. So, in your experience, who do you think is a key group or a key participant in this process who isn't brought up enough and who maybe should be more involved, maybe at the local level, maybe at the city level, where we can gain some ground in terms of improved disaster response?
I think every nation will have to identify an organization. Like, for example, for India, it's the NDMA, the National Disaster Management Authority. And then, of course, it's NDRF, and the BIMSTEC exercises were led by NDRF, as I mentioned. So that has to be one voice, and that is definitely also carries the weight of the government behind it. So when there is a call for help, it doesn't have to look back and say, can I go ahead or not? It's got the authority to act. It just requests the services of the other agencies. Like, for example, for mobility, it might be the Air Force for aircraft, or even civil aviation for that matter. You have the full backing of the government behind you, and that single voice, I think, should be good enough to drive agendas across national borders. So therefore, there has to be, as Dr. Cook said, lines of communication between these authorities, very open, and perhaps they need to have a look at meeting frequently, once in 6 months, once in maybe a year, relook issues, share experiences, and also learn lessons accordingly. So that, I think, would be a more workable solution. Lesser number of people involved, but a long line of communication across the board.
Yeah, I agree. I think let's not pretend otherwise in this region, that it is state-based action that we're looking at, right? So there is a role for NGOs and for other organizations, but it is really anchored in the state. So let's, I guess, remember that, but also, find ways to build trust between those different actors, whether it is the community organizations. Why is it? What barriers do we need to remove in order to encourage greater trust? Because it might be more about removing things than necessarily trying to bring together people who there are other issues going on which we perhaps aren't really thinking about in the first place. There, whether it is, usually it's power and money, but how that manifests itself in the locality is going to be different depending on which area is affected. So I think that there is a need for us to encourage greater appreciation of the diversity of actors and the niche capabilities of different organizations, and to be flexible in our engagement in those affected areas. So we shouldn't always just look at the default mandated agency necessarily, because there might be an alternative which has greater reach or access to those most in need.
Thank you, Dr. Cook. Thank you, Tom, for that question. We will go a little bit over our time today because I know we got started a little bit late. So if anyone would like to pose a final question to our speakers, please do raise your hand. But I will also ask our speakers to think about the kind of one takeaway. I know you've hit on a lot of different things within this discussion, and there's a lot of really great points I think that we'll unpack through the following conversations and in future discussions as well. But if you, in a kind of a 30-second wrap up, something that you would want to say to the various stakeholder groups, others working in this space on kind of the key next step, that might be my final ask to our panelists, if we have no final questions from our discussants. Okay, then I might turn to, if either of you would like to go with your kind of final parting word of wisdom, or ask to others in this space. I will let maybe Captain Parmar wrap us up as he started us.
All right, thank you. I'll just keep it brief. I think it's important that the approach to providing disaster relief, and it's mentioned in the Oslo Guidelines of '94, it should be based on the core principles of humanity, impartiality, and neutrality. And this needs to be across the board, whether it's a government or whether it's an independent organization or it's an international organization for that matter. And Ashley, since you mentioned Cyclone Nargis, Myanmar, just to give you that one simple example, is that Nargis hit Myanmar when Myanmar was opening its doors, the world at that point in time. And then, of course, there was the issue of, which was discussed in the UN, that Myanmar is not spreading the goodies all around and providing. I think that is best left to the government of that nation or the host nation to decide. So these three core principles should form the bedrock of all approaches, no matter which is the organization that is providing. That in itself will help to elevate the degree of trust. And after that, I think automatically everything else is going to fall into line. And I'll stop here.
Excellent. Thank you, Captain Parmar. A very good parting word. And to Dr. Cook.
For me, I think the real need that I see now and the next step is in the need to be thinking about our alternative future scenarios. That we're not having enough time spent on that we have a lot of initiatives and usually they're sectoral. So any way that we can imagine a future where we have fewer sectoral silos, greater synergy across actors, and more trust with the local communities, then the better in that. So I think we do have to now start to think bigger and better in trying to find something that can be achieved that will make our responses more effective when they're needed. I'll just end with that.
Excellent. Thank you both for working through some of my hypothetical questions that I've posed to you and for the insights that you've shared on some of the best practices and what might be some of the most effective ways we can increase collaboration on this first phase and as we get into our next several sessions. I will end us here today. Everyone, please join me in thanking Dr. Cook, Captain Parmar for sharing your insights. We look forward to having you continue to join us in these discussions and really appreciate your time and contribution of expertise. And with that, I will again extend my thanks and turn it back to Tom for the next part of our workshop tonight.
Thank you so much, Ashley. And again, thank you to our excellent panelists. Keeping the program moving along, we are going to take just a minute or two for everyone to freshen up, get some chai masala. If you're in India, perhaps, I'm sure I've mispronounced that. But we'll kick things off with our second panel where we'll be getting into some of the recovery efforts that we've already alluded to in our first discussion. So thanks very much. And we'll reconvene in just a few moments. All right, well, as we're sort of getting resettled back, excuse me, into our seats and sort of reconvening some of our panelists, I might ask Mr. Hassan and Dr. Manu if you could turn your videos on if you're able, in preparation for our second panel. I'm very excited that I was prepped so well by our previous panelists who mentioned so many times that we need the involvement of non-government organizations, because we're very excited to have two representatives from NGOs in the region with us on our second panel. So if we're reconvening, thank you all for sticking with us. I know that it's getting deep into the program, and we're very excited to continue with our second panel of the day, where we'll be unpacking some of the recovery efforts and some of the aspects of recovery in disaster management. I'd like to introduce our two panelists, Dr. Manu Gupta of SEEDS India and Mr. Mohammed Mahmoudul Hassan of the Christian Commission for Development in Bangladesh. So I'll start with Dr. Manu. Dr. Manu Gupta is a co-founder of SEEDS India. SEEDS stands for Sustainable Environment and Ecological Development Society, which is an NGO focused on protecting the lives and livelihoods of people exposed to disasters. Dr. Gupta holds degrees in physical planning and urban planning from the School of Planning and Architecture, New Delhi, and a doctorate in community-based disaster management from Kyoto University, Japan. He and his organization bring decades of experience working at the forefront of disaster management efforts, and we're very happy to have him teeing us off on our second panel here today. Dr. Gupta, if we might start with you, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tom, and good evening, good morning to all colleagues here. It's indeed a pleasure to be part of this panel, and I've been listening very intently with the previous panel discussion and some of the points that came about, not just the role of NGOs, but also the need to go local and as local as possible. So greetings to all, and colleagues at the US Consulate, and colleagues at the Commissioner's Office in Chennai, and I see a lot of friends here, so hello to all of you. In India and in the region, I would say that we have moved the needle. We have, from a very relief-driven kind of models, we have moved to looking at long-term recovery and mitigation. To that extent, we have done some good policy changes, and unfortunately, it had been these major incidents that made us look at these areas. And following such major emergencies, we've had some very successful public reconstruction program. But today, I just wanted to highlight, as I've been asked, to look at the role of communities in disaster recovery in particular, which takes a little bit of a shift from a usual command and control approach that we've been used to. Yeah. So I thought I'll speak about this through my own experience as a co-founder for SEEDS, which has been working in this post-disaster recovery in South and Southeast Asia for around 2.5 decades. My real journey started in 2001 in the Gujarat earthquake in Western India. And, I was much younger then, and we were helping people out who had lost everything in the earthquake, helping them rebuild their houses. But what we really discovered in that whole process of engagement with the communities was that, the people affected with disasters, affected by the disasters, along with their wisdom and their abilities, can actually make a significant contribution and be central to the process of building back better. It seemed almost like an accidental discovery, but thereafter, I've personally worked in almost 35 emergencies in this region. Whether they and there have been different contexts like earthquakes to tsunamis to floods, and now lately the pandemic. every time I've tested this model of collaboration, and every time I've learned something, and I've actually been able to improve on that model. In the process, we've realized that communities are better prepared. They are becoming more resilient to future disasters or shocks and stresses, and are also able to help out each other, mutual help within communities as a result of a much more inclusive disaster recovery process that we have worked upon. We have looked at these community-based models in Chennai and after the 2015 floods, where we worked on some of the housing recovery programs, but also some time ago some time back on the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, where Commissioner Bedi was active in Cuddalore, but we also worked in some of the other coastal areas in the state. And some of those lessons have been applied there. I also want to share another anecdote, and an important aspect or a value system that is central to this inclusive disaster recovery process. And that was in the 1998 cyclone in Gujarat again. The cyclone was not so severe, but unfortunately, the warning systems were not in place for people to be prepared. And as a result, within a few hours of that cyclone, over 3,000 people died. Their homes were destroyed, schools were no longer usable, agriculture fields inundated with saline water from the sea. But the biggest life loss was among these salt pan workers. So there are these great salt deserts in the western part of the country. And we have these migrant labor who are working in these salt pans. And obviously, because there were no wind buffers, there was always this, the wind really picked up speed. And with that, it took away their structures and maimed them, and a lot of lives were lost. And of course, they didn't have any advance warning to evacuate themselves. So as an aid worker, then also I was doing the disaster relief work and, moving from one village to another. We would be giving away food and, other supplies. But actually, this whole relief work didn't go as well as we expected. Perhaps in our enthusiasm to give, we never really considered their needs and their cultural practices. In some sense, we took away the agency of people. And as grateful they were to us for helping them, I could sense that pain for having to accept food or clothes that they could not wear. So, we live in this part of the world where the conventional relief model has this colonial legacy of, famine relief before independence. And that kind of thing has perpetuated in some way, where basic rights, basic needs of the people who are affected have never been taken into consideration. And so I think this was a life transforming experience for all of us. We also realized that, good amount of preparedness could have actually saved those lives. A good amount of participation in pre-positioning, something which my previous speakers in the panel also spoke about, could have actually reduced life loss. So the whole point here being that how do we restore the agency of people in this whole bigger process of disaster relief to disaster reconstruction? And I think the models of building back better have some of those principles now being incorporated. So the Gujarat earthquake was our first experience of, creating that building back better kind of models, where communities actually contributed in many, many ways, from contributing their labor to their ideas to their whole range of activities that I thought couldn't have been possible if we had not created that kind of enabling framework. And finally, I just wanted to highlight, few common myths about participation of communities in disaster recovery that I think is relevant for the discussion today also. There is this popular thinking that because communities are affected, their situations, their conditions do not allow them to participate and make good, informed choices. Well, I can say that it's a completely wrong understanding here. In fact, we've found that participating in post-disaster recovery has actually helped in rebuilding that sense of agency, but not to mention the therapeutic effect participation in reconstruction has on individual lives. Second, involving communities sometimes is construed as slowing down the entire reconstruction process. And again, I think this needs to be corrected, because in a recent project in Nepal, where Government of India was supporting the Nepal reconstruction project, 26,000 houses were built in a matter of 2 years using what we call the owner-driven reconstruction process, as opposed to this contractor-driven process, in very, very difficult conditions, very, very difficult terrain. And owners took a real lead in actually making and expediting the reconstruction process. And third is about knowledge. Communities are not, expected to be aware of the latest advancement in science and technology, for example. Well, this could be true to some extent. But what we also discover that there is an equally large repository of traditional wisdom and experience that lies in the community. And it takes a good partnership model to unleash this good exchange of knowledge and wisdom on both sides. So let me just conclude that in the last 2 decades, we've been seeing disaster events have been doubling. And in fact, some estimates say that by the end of this decade, there'll be 5 disasters a single day in somewhere in the world. With that kind of frequency and intensity, I think we need to take this all of society approach. And so we need to really work around this kind of model of all of society, and bring the shift of including people, creating this bottom-up process, and creating knowledge repositories to where they are really needed. So let me stop here, Tom, and I'll come back when there are more questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gupta. I know I have several questions, but I will hold those until after we've had a chance to hear from our other speaker. But thank you again for your remarks. Before we get to some of those questions, I'm happy to introduce Mr. Mohammed Mahmoudul Hassan, who is the Climate Change Coordinator at the Christian Commission for Development in Bangladesh. Mr. Hassan has participated as an observer and panelist at the UN Climate Change Conference for many years and has earned multiple degrees from across Europe and South Asia. And we are very excited to have his inputs here as well, offering us some of his perspectives working at the Christian Commission for Development in Bangladesh. Without further ado, Mohammed Hassan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tom, and good evening from Dhaka, Bangladesh. Might be I'm the only one from Bangladesh and tomorrow's sessions. And thank you very much, NBR, of my colleagues here. And thank you very much, all respected guests here and audience. Your people are very expert. And definitely, I'm the person from the field. And thank you, all of the keynote speakers, as well as the Dr. Cook, Captain Sharabjit sir, and Dr. Manu sir already mentioned many features. And as I'm the last one, so my life has been easy. When I was talking here now, around 10 districts of Bangladesh are experiencing seasonal flood. And now I was just looking at these flood forecasting centers. Now water is come to the surroundings of the Dhaka, greater Dhaka here, but last week it was north part of the Bangladesh. You know that we have a delta regions and Ganges belt as well as the Brahmaputra belt here. This is the incident of this month. But if I go back 3 months from now, month of May, there was a cyclone Yash. And already my colleagues from India, they have mentioned several cyclones and incident. From now 2 or 3 months later, in the month of November, Almighty knows, we are expecting 1 or 2 cyclones from the Indian Oceans. So this is the life, flood, cyclones, and the government people and the people who are working in these NGOs or are now quite busy. This is the case, yes. And thank you, all of you here and hearing me. Christian Commission for Development, CCDB, has started its journey in 1973 after the liberation war of Bangladesh, and to fulfillment the need of our freedom fighters and rehabilitation programs, especially for last 40 years. They have done several works from the response, recovery, as well as the mitigations there also. We have a couple of comprehensive program on poverty reductions, climate change programs, as well as some resettlement program. But disaster management has been embedded in all of the programs here. The climate change program that started in 2009, especially when 2007 and 2009 is a very important year here, because Cyclone Cedar and Cyclone Isla, one of the two devastating cyclones, have taught us many things. People understand the climate change, frequency of the cyclones all happened from actually 2007 and 9. And after that, CCTV started a massive work on the disaster response as well as this recovery. I want to bring all of you from now to 2009, month of May, when Isla hit the southwestern corner of Bangladesh. That district name is Satkhira, close to Calcutta of West Bengal. I was talking one of the persons, 65 years old. He was mentioning me just after 3 days, when the response already over there, that person was standing for 4 hours to get 1 glass of drinking water, because after Isla, the whole area has been inundated with saline water. You people know that saline intrusion is a very, very crucial problem, the southern belt there. And he was standing for 4 hours. And when I was listening, I was crying. And in Dhaka, our capital city, we spent 10 liters water flushing this toilet, something like that. So sometimes we mentioned my guys that please visit the southern belt. The millions of people are suffering from the saline water intrusion, especially after the cyclone, when the embankment just break down. Now come to 2020. Last year, cyclone Amphan hit that area. Couple of embankments has been destroyed. Saline water came into this locality. Situation same like the situation Isla, but the people's life have been differented. That person has 3 sources of pure drinking water. Number 1, they have rainwater harvesting. Number 2, they have some high-raised pond we call pond sand filtration. That is something filtering of this water, very common in the southern belt of Bangladesh. And number 3, we have a high technology solar-powered river osmosis system. If a cyclone hit that place, next 24 to 48 hours, there is no electricity, shutdown of this electricity. And rain and the saline water comes to this, all the ponds are salty, but that solar powered river osmosis system was running. So that is something different what actually we advocate to this government door that do something. And really, it's very good that if you look at this last 10 years in Bangladesh, that we have a very good policies, actually, no doubt. We have a very good policies of this Disaster Management Act. We have a very updated standing order on SOD 2019. We have a union disaster committee till the village level. So very good structure from top, that is the National Disaster Council, like India. Then we have a Ministry of Disaster Management and Relief, and then district level, sub-district level, union level. Couple of villages comprises a union. Now it comes to the ward level. 2 or 3 villages comprise a union, like India, there's a panchayat committee, something like that. So we have a very good structure of this information from low level to this high level. Just after 24 hours, that Union Disaster Management Committee take the information from that surrounding couple of villages. That times our NGO people help them, cooperate them, because that couple of persons was not able to roaming all the villages. So we give them information, what happened, where the bird has embankment has been splitted out, and which area needs access to the clean drinking water. In such a way, we give this information to them, and especially the first vital task for us to access clean drinking water. because most of the pond have been inundated with saline water. So we just pull out all the water along with the community people that Manu sir already mentioned, the community people, community, and the community. That is my strong voice, and where I get the chance, I raise this voice because my person, my villagers, they don't have the chance to go to the UNFCCC, but we are planning for them. And you rightly mentioned that down top needs to be very important. For example, I can give one example. Bangladesh is developing first our national adaptation plan. So we are trying to keep the voice to them that make, because every sub-district has a unique features to adapt to the disaster, because our expert already mentioned that every disaster has a unique features. So that locality needs their own indigenous knowledge to be incorporated with the state-of-the-art technologies. So we need local level adaptation plan for climate change as well as disaster. That if we culminate all together, Bangladesh has 64 districts. So if 64 districts come to a common area, definitely we can get a very good area, and that we need a very good evidence from the field. My one of the part is something like that. Actually, I work from this field to conduct some research work that how much people are adopting the adaptation technologies, or what the degree of the adaptation people have been experiencing last 20 years, and how the local people can work into this national adaptation plan or the others area. And rightly, you have mentioned that capacity building, that is the most important part for us. We train the local people, local villagers, because when the water goes out, that local people are provided with seeds, saline tolerant seeds, or saline tolerant vegetable seeds, so that they can cultivate. Even last 10 years, many NGOs work in the southern belt. And if you go to the southern belt, you will find uplifted, elevated some places where people can easily cultivate. You will find some hanging vegetation on their wall. So at least they can cultivate some potatoes or some chilies. Because saline water in that area, the Cyclone Ila, 3 years, they were not able to cultivate the land due to the salinity. And salinity is increasing upward of this Bangladesh. And very good something that if you think that collaboration or something like that, we have a very good correlation with our friend India there. Because when I was talking this type of cyclones, Bangladesh Meteorological Department and Ministry of Disaster Management and Relief, they they just pass the information with this Indian Meteorological Department. Even I take this information from my local area. I take the information from Indian Meteorological Department, because I know my Meteorology Department would give the information, but to my local people, I give this information earlier to them so that they can work on such a way. We suggest them from the preparedness that if there is any yielding period, they can take the crop from this land. And that way, number 2 is very important, that the sheltering of these houses. And after, when the people go out from the shelter, sometimes that shelter house is damaged. So it is a very important for the reconstructions and manage of this embankment, what is called the shelter. And we are trying to develop cyclone shelter in a multi-purpose way. For example, in that area, we have developed community-based organization we call Community Climate Resilience Center. It's a community-based organization. So the local people work together. They give the agenda, what to be done in the priority list. We just facilitate to them. We train them, and they give this information to the local government. And that cyclone shelter, we are trying to keep as a, let's say, storage of the food or storage of the seed, training center, and some rooms for the pregnant women, because they are the most victim. Even our sisters, our daughters, they are the most victim, because many, even after the disaster, sorry to say, men will not go to collect this water. That women, they go to collect the water. Even now, when the situation is quite fine, many places women go spend 3 to sometimes 2 hours, 3 hours to collect the water, because saline water. So, and they have a limited version of the rainwater harvesting as well as the sand pond filtration, something like that. So in couple of areas, actually, I always put in my level 2 these community people, because community people is our asset. If we train them, sometimes they don't need this money. Sometimes they don't need the food, but they can do by themselves. But problem is that issues is that that how many times they will leave their house when the signal number 7 to 10. They leave their house in the 2 months ago, they might be leave their house next after the 2 months. If I ask you, please leave your house, will you do that? Is it possible to leave your house? So huge thousands of people, they leave the house, and sometimes we face difficulties to bring them from their house. That is a couple of areas actually we are trying to put together that even when we're talking about this recovery, we have to also change from this preparedness and response altogether in such a way. So my focus is that community-based organization should be extended. They need to be incorporated in the each and every national plan for climate change, national plan for disaster management. This is from my side now, and hopefully we'll be happy to get more questions and talk more altogether.
So much, Hassan. It seems that you were prescient in your points, or perhaps you simply read the chat, because we have an excellent question from Dr. Sabina Rashid, who is asking both of our panelists. I might pose this as our first in the Q&A. What is the focus on the most marginalized groups in these communities? Persons with disabilities, households headed by females, poorer households, that often don't have access to the network or social capital that others have, and maybe speak a little about how your organizations can incorporate some of that thinking.
You want me to go first, or Hassan could take this up?
Sorry, you can go first.
All right. Okay. No, I think this is a very important point here. First, to acknowledge that this is a real challenge in disaster recovery. In fact, in all cycles of disaster, because we've seen that the marginalized groups are the ones that are most affected, even within an affected community. And it often happens that these are the people who are living on marginal lands, and therefore the impact of disasters on them is disproportionately higher than others. But even within existing social structures, there could be individuals, there could be women groups, elderly, who require that special attention. So of course, the overall principle of disaster recovery is to leave no one behind. I think this is a very well established principle that we've all been practicing. But practically, I think what it really translates into is to look at very specific and differential strategies that can ensure that they are included. It starts from something like a post-disaster needs assessment, which especially takes care of their needs, which could actually mean we have separate dialogues with them. We actually do a separate assessment of their needs, their vulnerabilities. But at the same time, when it comes to designing interventions and program interventions, we have taken care of looking at what kind of contribution and what kind of role they have in decision making for the community. And that is a particularly sensitive area that needs to be worked on. There is a lot of argument against this part, saying that, in a disaster recovery scenario, you can't really alter the social construct because there is already a need that is felt across the segment, across the social system. But I would argue against that. And I do feel that this is also the time to actually look at very, very specific strategies that ensure the inclusion of the most marginalized. But I'm sure Hassan can share more from his experience about how does he look at the excluded groups within his interventions.
Thank you, Mansoor, because here you can see that what actually happened in some places, in the very remote places. Look at here, the World Disaster Management Committee or the union, that is the very base level. Actually, their most important part to include each and every corner of their villages, actually. But no doubt, no doubt, issue of the transparency, issue of the sometimes social conflict or some biasness took place. But interestingly, the NGOs, they actually do their best from their side. Because I was looking at these questions, note panels here. Sabina ma'am already asked a couple of questions. Now the cyclone shelter that is made by these governments and other what is called development organizations, they are trying to put a separate toilets for the what is called ladies and this area, and you will find for the physically disabled people, they can easily move to the cyclone shelters. Sometimes, and very important that in case of the security issues, solar powered street light are being distributed from the Ministry of Disaster Management and Relief from their own revenue, because during this disaster you will not get electricity. But I have seen that many women, they mentioned that they can go, even there is a flat like that water something this height, because at night they know where the street light is there, they can easily move. So security has been ensured, and that is the one of the credit or achievement from these NGOs who talked last 10 years to put this type of solar street lights, this type of village areas and the remote portions of these villages where the many marginalized peoples do there. For example, in our organizations, we have tried to make a risk score for each of the households where we actually work. Let's say low score, medium score, and high score. So from that scoring of the households, we understand who are the on top of the high score. But that from this experience, after the disaster, everyone in the high score. The rich people of this village, his 20 acres land has been inundated with the water just within one night. But really, we are trying to put this information, especially our climate change strategy action plan and the gender gap. There is a policies are being developed here. We are trying to put this information from the it's called our field area and the real field.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rashid. And thank you both for your responses. You have both, if I might, sort of follow up on a theme that we've been touching on a little bit throughout this program, of this idea of building back better. It's a common phrase these days, mostly in my experience, having been used in conjunction with the ongoing coronavirus pandemic and in response and recovery efforts with that. In your experience, what does building back better look like, and how can stakeholders at various levels, in your experience, maybe at the NGO or the more local level, what's the role that they can play in the recovery process and in building back better?
Hassan, would you like to go first, or?
Oh, okay, I can go now. No problem. Thank you. Yes, building back better is definitely. But again, I can go to that community resilience climate center comprised of the villagers who are actually play their active role in their villages actually. Because for example, I can go from Dhaka, staying for a couple of days, but they know their real problems. But actually what we have to do during the mapping and assessment of them, we can give them some more expertise to them, as well as this is very important for us, that is a local government should be extended. The local level, because many local, they have the politicians, influential politicians, there are lots of development works going on from the disaster management teams as well as the other infrastructure. So that local government, as well as this type of influential group of these from the villagers, they needs to come and sit together. Sometimes we have seen from the experience, my villagers want something that way. However, the local government, some a political influential person, they try to divert this road to their way. It happened. So in such a way, we have to get the priority and the must priority of these local people. So that cases advocacy is much more required. So we are trying to extend that the CBOs in the coastal belt as well as the southern belt. And we know that if they are trained, properly trained, if they understand at least a very layman way how policy works, even how the national policy, I have to bring down the national policy from Dhaka to that southern belt to the villages. So I have to convey this one to them in their own language. Otherwise, I will do a sin something that I'm hiding something. This is my feeling. So always we try to extend that local community. There is no way to keep them. If we extend them in name of this capacity building, as well as incorporate them in this local level plannings, I think the building back better can be possible.
Yeah, just building on what Hassan said, and he spoke about local politicians and how they've used and abused the term building back better ever since it was first introduced. I remember after the 2004 tsunami, when President Clinton used it as the UN ambassador touring the affected areas. And there have been also quite a few academic research and studies done on what does it really mean, operationally and strategically. And I think what I have come to really understand this is it's not so much about enhancing incomes, or improving your housing quality from what it was before, but it's actually about reducing vulnerabilities. It is about cutting losses when the next time the disaster strikes again. So Hassan spoke about the difference for that person from Ayla to Amphan, about his access to clean drinking water. I think that's building back better. That's about how I'm able to figure out a way that I can break through this vicious cycle of losses that have kind of perpetuated from a whole legacy of disasters in my own geography, and break away from there to become resilient and strong enough. So to me, that is building back better, and maybe this is an operational definition of looking at it, but I think that's what counts really on the ground. Tom?
Absolutely. Thank you for highlighting some of those excellent points. We do have a hand raised from our audience, Dr. Pushp Bajaj of the National Maritime Foundation. I had a feeling you might have some inputs on some of these climate change issues. So please, Dr. Pushp.
Great. Thank you very much, Tom, and thank you to the panelists for those interesting comments. I had a question for Mr. Hassan, and you mentioned climate change a couple of times in your remarks, and it is talking about climate change and long-term recovery and long-term strategies in general. We know that sea level rise is going to be a challenging problem, and especially in Bangladesh, arguably the coastal regions, as and when they see more and more areas getting inundated, they're probably going to move northwards and towards Dhaka, and which is already pretty crowded. So I wanted to know, what are some of the strategies that are you seeing any strategies being devised and implemented in Bangladesh to take care of this internal migration that's going to happen from the coastal regions to the hinterland areas? And have you yourself worked on something that tries to prepare the region for this type of internal migration? Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your very nice questions, because we are facing these internal migrations as well. Even this cyclone Amphan, especially cyclone Ayla, many people even left from our houses, our project areas sometimes. But really, what actually our NGOs are trying actually to keep them in that area, we are trying to adopt the social safety network program, something like that, alternative income generation. Let's say the fishermen or the who have a couple of lands for this agriculture, if they lose their land, so might be they will leave that places to go to other places. But in case of fishermen, especially this coastal area, they will not leave that places actually. They will stay there to somehow. So we are trying to give them some alternative income generation. And if you go to the southern belt, you will find people don't have, might be they have some main occupations, but apart from them, they have others occupation, even sometimes 2 or 3. So that because after a couple of cyclones or this type of incident of this saline water intrusion that you rightly mentioned, it just came to the Barishal district, around 100 kilometers from the southern belt. So we expect sometimes it will come to Dhaka to some days. So even government have adopted and they are extended the social safety network so that people can stay in their places rather than to come the other cities.
Excellent point. Thank you, Dr. Bajaj, for the excellent question. I know that the issues of migration and displacement frequently come up surrounding climate change issues and are often brought to the very fore during natural disasters like cyclones. Sort of taking a little step back here, we were speaking earlier about how the phases are not, it is perhaps, perhaps unfair to think of this as truly different phases when it's really just one long process where we go from response to recovery and then from recovery to the more longer term thinking. What, in your opinion, is the role for NGOs and for your organizations to transition from that response to some of those longer term recovery questions, to go past the weeks following a disaster and then move it to some of the bigger strategic level preparation for the next disaster and things like that?
Let me take that first, Hassan, and then you can add to my points here. No, that's a good thing to discuss here, Tom, because I believe that there are different skill sets that are required in relief than recovery and reconstruction, which is much more long term. I think the focus in the relief part is how quickly and how well, how sensitively we are able to provide relief to the most affected people, because that's the only way we can help them bounce back faster. And so the focus is on logistics, the focus is on operational efficiencies. We spoke about HADR guidelines. There is also the incident command systems and many other quick response mechanisms that we need to look at. And I don't exclude NGOs from having that kind of capabilities. And I think beyond the Red Cross, the roles of local organizations that have been highlighted in the previous panel as well is very important. So how quickly a neighbor can reach out to an affected person in their own immediate environment requires some skill and training. So that is one set of skills which are very, very different from looking at long-term reconstruction, long-term inclusive approaches. And within organizations, we do have separate teams to look at that. And when I say within organizations, I'm speaking on behalf of many national and local humanitarian organizations who have separate teams to look at these issues. Of course, some of the tools, some of the approaches have a common denominator about how do you keep communities at the center? How do we ensure transparency that Hassan spoke about, as well as accountability to people so that we don't end up committing something and then delivering something else. I think those are things that are like common threads that help us transition from relief to recovery to long-term mitigation and preparedness. But when it comes to actual implementation on the ground, I think we are looking at completely different, not completely, but quite different and distinct skill sets out there. Hassan, would you like to add?
Yes, I do agree to you, Dr. Manu. Same point to from my side that is very important from the preparedness as well as the response and the recovery. Here, one thing I can give you an example as example. Look at here, government has their own plan actually. So even they have their committee, the standing committee to this base level. So they have their plan for what they will do in next couple of years even. They have that plan. On the other hand, we NGOs also take the separate projects from our own projects, but we collaborate to this local government. That is very important, and we also give this information to this government because there is something clause that the same group will not be overlapped by others organization. I work with the villagers. You will come, and so it is something like that. One group will get this everything, but rest of all will be just out of this area. So that is the very important factor. But again, I will come to that issues that the comprehensiveness, especially let's say in Bangladesh, or we have a very nice policies. We have a very nice plans who will work and when, but we are a very highly populated populated country, many people here, and even during this COVID, it is extreme level of what is called very hard for us when the people come to the shelter. How I will keep them is a social distancing at night, and with this ensuring this mask. So we have to think, and we need some paradigm shift, considering our new preparedness, especially this recovery phase, when the people will come together and they will work for. We have some program for cash for work. So they will cut the canals, they will clean these water bodies, they will make the embankment, and they will be paid in the afternoon. But many people work together. So how we will ensure to keep them in the social distancing due to this COVID pandemic until everyone will be vaccinated. So definitely we have to think in a different way.
Absolutely. I actually wanted to sort of take the lead that you just sort of put down there, and just ask for the benefit of the program, I guess. How has more specifically, how has the current and ongoing coronavirus pandemic, how has that affected your work and your organizations? It is in some ways kind of a perpetual natural disaster that the entire world is experiencing. And how has that intersected with some of the more traditional work? I know that Hassan mentioned already some of the difficulties with having a cyclone during a pandemic, and how maybe can we start to think about those intersections between different kinds of natural disasters, natural hazards.
So can
Hassan,
I go
would you
first
like
or Manu sir?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay. Okay. Thanks, Tom, to bring these issues and questions. Definitely. Let's say after the Amphan last year and Yash this year, my team had to go these places to internalize that events in our program. So no way, we have to do this work. My team has have been affected. I was affected last couple of weeks. So we don't know how we've been affected, something like that. But we have to work for these people actually, because if we look at how much they are striving for this clean drinking water, how much they are striving for their agricultural land, problem of the salinity. So that times we face that we are so much lucky and working here and to do something for the people. And we have tried to some strategies, for example, let's say when we do for the response work, at least we try to manage the keep social distancing. Even at least we have installed some water with this, some soap and some what's called mask and produced from the same village. So we have given the task to these villagers, so they produces the mask. So that that will also be used during this pandemic if any disaster come in next couple of months or something like that. So, however, we have been affected, but we are trying to manage because we know that it would be continued next couple of years at least if the 100% people of this Bangladesh will be vaccinated. That is the case actually.
Yeah. No, I think these are very relevant issues that you've highlighted. I mean, last year, I remember when the first wave hit India, we were looking at, this whole intersection of the cyclone Amphan, particularly that hit, Bangladesh and parts of India, and how difficult it was for people to be evacuated in the cyclone shelters, which did not have that kind of capacity considering social distancing. And not only that, there were examples where the water entered hospitals and other health infrastructure, and all that medical waste actually got mixed up, and we could see masks floating around and a lot of spread of infection. So there have been challenges on that front, and I think the world is still looking for all the answers at this point of time. We are all struggling to figure out what would be the most resilient way to live with the pandemic, since it's not going to go away soon enough. But some of the good things that we have learned is how do we really tie our disaster recovery and reconstruction strategies to individuals and people, and not at system level alone. I think that breaking that down into individuals who have been impacted, and this relates to also the question about the most marginalized. How do we really, redesign our programs that are expected to reach to individuals? Because what we noticed also was that, a lot of the affected people were migrants who started moving to villages because there was economic lockdown and they couldn't pay their rents in the cities, and obviously they had no work, so they would return to and they would even walk kilometers and across cities to reach back. And so how do you reach out to them? We have also looked at how, because of these online classes for young school students, just last week there was a research that said that 8% of the children are lost. We don't know where they are, because there is no way we can track them now. And 37% of the children don't want to come back to school. So I think these are challenges that we have to look at. How do we, in our recovery strategies? The good news is that some of these tools that we've been conventionally using in a natural hazard setting have a good level of application and relevance in the post-pandemic recovery as and when it happens. So I would say that it's still work in progress, and I think all of us are grappling with this question, Tom, in some way or other. And it seems nobody has really hit the right button so far. At least that's the view from here.
Absolutely, and hopefully we can all work towards hitting that button soon. I did want to turn to a question from the chat, or a comment from the chat that I will turn into a question from Subrat Dash, who talks about how in humanitarian efforts, with these discussions of response and recovery, this is often a reactionary or a reactive policy. And how, in your opinions, could we help? I think that you've probably touched on some of these as well. How could we help make this process more proactive so that we can get out in front? I know that we're trying to discuss disaster recovery, but I think that, as we've also mentioned, some of those lessons can be incorporated throughout the process. So how could we maybe try and become more proactive?
Yeah, no doubt. We need to be proactive in a scenario where we are seeing recurrence of disasters hitting the same communities. So when I said building back better, I actually meant that how do you incorporate long-term disaster risk reduction strategies, resilience building strategies as part of disaster recovery? What that practically means is that when we rebuild these homes, we ensure that these homes are now resistant to future earthquakes or future cyclones. That's building back better, right? And so I think it's almost like a given that a good, inclusive disaster recovery strategies has to necessarily include components of disaster risk reduction and preparedness. And it's this entire continuum from starting with quick recovery, quick relief, reaching out to people in quickest possible time, to having an inclusive disaster reconstruction program and preparedness measures built in, is what makes a community truly resilient to disasters. So I think maybe I was not explicit enough in my description of things, but it's really very much an inherent part of any good disaster reconstruction strategy. Tom? Or Hassan would like to add to that.
Yes, do you agree to Dr. Manu that, and especially here you can see that here, I can just give one example, two examples actually, if you permit the time now. For example, let's say Bangladesh House Building Research Institute, who actually designed the buildings. So now they have developed some house. Those are what is called cyclone stress building. They are mentioning that cyclone stress building. So what we are doing, we are going for some prototype buildings or prototype housing for in the coastal belts. We are trying to look into that how much it works during this disaster or something like that. On the other hand, I found one guy, just 14 years old, a guy in the southern belt of Bangladesh there. Last time when the Amphan hit that area, I was just surprised because we are thinking about the pure drinking water for the people-centered. But he was thinking about his cattle, because there is an incident 10 years ago when the Isla hit that area. Thousands of cattle and livestock just died for drinking saline water, and what's called what's called grass there. But what he did, he purchased 5 days ago of a cyclone. He purchased a water tank. He get water there, pouring water there, clean drinking water, some portions for them and some portions for the cattle. And interestingly, in that couple of houses, their cattle were died, but in his case, there is a good sources of water at least for 7 days. Then the recovery started, and the pure clean drinking water sources has come. So that what we tried this last year, and now we are trying to emphasizing on the drinking water for the cattle in that area, because we didn't think in such a way. But that 14 years guy give us a right track.
That's an excellent.
Tom, if I may
yes, go ahead, please.
Interject. I reread Shubhrat's comment, and I can now understand where he's coming from. And I can see that, you know, the perspective there is, and unfortunately so, that the whole world gets, the sector gets divided between the so-called humanitarians and the development guys and the climate change guys. And they don't necessarily work together all the time, because, you know, each of them is guided by their own donor policies and their own institutional mechanisms. And yes, so in that sense, lately we've seen changes. We've spoken about the nexus issues. We've spoken about anticipatory action when it comes to climate change and humanitarian action. We've looked at the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, which necessarily brings these two together. And the World Humanitarian Summit outcomes, the agenda for humanity, also looks at that. Yes, but I can understand that, you know, there isn't that kind of clear understanding or an obvious understanding about the transition or the inclusion of the principles of climate change, sensitivity, anticipatory action bit, and disaster risk reduction and humanitarian action coming together so easily. And so, yes, there is a problem there, and which needs to be addressed.
Absolutely. That's one of the key aims of fora like this, is to try and to sort of bridge some of those gaps. I did want to move to, we have a hand raised from Chandan Ghosh. If I'm pronouncing your name correctly, I apologize if I'm not. But please. I'm afraid we can't hear you.
Yeah, I first apologize for late entry into, but it is a very interesting discussion, listening to our dearest Manu, and we and also from Bangladesh, Muhammadul Hassan. Especially
you can just call me Hassan.
Perspectives. And I'm from NIDM, National Institute of Disaster Management, and thank you for giving this chance to be here, though it started at 5:30, but I would like to see that based on the discussions that which was going on for almost in this when I entered. So one thing is that just only in brief only, because your time is there, what I would like to say that as far as technology is concerned, what I would say that just only last Sunday, I have gone to the shop, and we wanted to purchase replace our old freezer, which was bought 15 years ago, and which used to consume 3 units per day as electricity, 230 liter. And when we got into the shop, we see that it is more than 2.5 times the present freeze, which I am having, freezer, and electricity consumption is 1/6 of what I am spending so far. So the technology that which has brought us so far, and it can be run by the inverter. For the last 10 years, it is there. So as far as technology is concerned, especially for Bangladesh or cyclone years, just I want to mention that we have got the technology and know-how where, enter Bangladesh or even city Chennai or Mumbai, where Miti River is there, hardly 100 meter, enter Bangladesh or Sundarban. If we make small earthen embankment, for that no technology is required. And what we know that whenever tidal surge come, they are hardly 3 to 4 meter, which is hardly the height of a building, like 1 floor. So making embankment or making geosynthetic, there are huge amount of geosynthetics we produce from our petroleum industry. We can put them across the river in less than 3 days or 4 days of time. We can make 500 kilometers of dam or embankment ready-made. No work is required. Only 2 to 3 days is required even to make 500 kilometer or layered of pipe. It is called geotube. So 3 meter, 4 meter, we can stop entering the salt water, like saline water, entering into the hinterland. Like as you mentioned, Mr. Hassan, that it has entered 100 kilometer, because Bangladesh, hardly few meter is the difference between this ocean, this Bay of Bengal, and maybe up to Dhaka. So it can. So when it is a total height is as high as maximum 6 to 7 meter so we can make this kind of embankment 1, 2, and over that another one. So it becomes 3 plus 3, 6 meter high. It doesn't cost much. So when we protect the entire hinterland across, even city of Chennai also, which doesn't take even 1 week time, cost nothing, technology, material, everything is available. So in that case, we can sort out the problem of entering of salt water during cyclone or tidal surge into our sweet water, which is a precious thing. Another thing is using same material, whereas 85% of our water is from the Brahmaputra or from Ganga through Farakka. It is going to meet the sea, and we are not able to hold them. For that, we don't need barrage. We need only this membrane, which will be used as a holdall to keep 10 lakh liter, 20 lakh liter, million liter of water on the riverbed. So this precious water, like you have mentioned about one of the child, 15 years old who have managed to buy the water. When we take care of our river and saltwater entry there itself with some structural measures, and those structural measures are easy to do, affordable technology, it doesn't cost, then many of the problem of resilience, then we can take care while protecting from the outside. So protecting at the where it is at the entry. In that way, most of our coastal cities also flexible storage system or coastal reservoir storing sweet water, which is always required for fishing or anything. And when it rains so much, more than 2 meters of rainfall is there, when only 50 centimeters of rainfall is enough to meet up our need for sweet water. So in a larger scale, in order before allowing this disturb our own area, especially salt water during cyclone or during tidal variations, we have to take care of some kind of structural measures which are straightforward, easy, affordable, and very swift construction can be done. The rest of the things we can reconfigure with the community, that how to protect themselves from the bigger impact of cyclone before they become a disaster. So this is what I want. Maybe tomorrow I'll say, I may be giving some of those examples in terms of few slides that how they work.
Thank you so much, Professor Ghosh. Really appreciate your emphasis on the importance of the changing nature of how we can respond to these disasters based on advances that we've made recently. I know that we are over time, and thank you all for your flexibility and for your participation. As I mentioned at the outset, I know that I still have many questions, and I know that many of you probably do as well. I would encourage all of you to return to tomorrow's panels as well, and also for the final breakout sessions where we can get into some of the more detailed questions that we've had. But please join me in thanking our panelists, Mr. Hassan and Dr. Gupta. Your panels were excellent. Thank you so much for your remarks. Thank you for all of your questions from our distinguished participants. And I look forward to speaking with all of you again soon. Thank you to our speaker, Mr. Gagandeep Singh Bedi, and to Consul General for her remarks at the top of the program. On that note, I wish you all a very good evening or a very good day, depending on where you are on Earth. And I look forward to being in touch and seeing you all again, same time tomorrow. Thank you all, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Hassan.